Probably as good a time to get started. My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm Vice President at AudioEye. We're a company that helps and assists organizations in making their digital and web content both accessible and usable. So you are all here based on the title, so it would be appropriate that the content represents what the title was, and that's about making third-party platforms accessible and usable. So to do that and to sort of get into a little bit of context, I always find that it's probably a worthwhile exercise to go through some of sort of the basics to get everybody up to the same level of understanding on the concept of digital accessibility. I know that there are a number of vendors that are here, a number of providers here that live within that realm, but I also want to make certain that we all get caught up. I'm a big fan of doing ABC before we start on DEF, just to make certain that we're all there. So just to give you a little bit of context and a little bit of understanding of the whole topic. I mean, a lot of this is, there's a number of different terms, there's a number of different phrases that folks use when it comes to making reference to or addressing the topic of digital accessibility. We have customers who will call and say, I need you to help me make my website ADA compliant, Section 508 compliant, WCAG compliant. At the end of the day, it's all about making digital and web content accessible. And you know, the concept of accessibility really is starting to extend, and the Americans with Disabilities Act and the fairly sizable celebration of its 25th anniversary that took place last summer has really brought a lot of focus into the applicability of the Americans with Disabilities Act to digital and web architectures. So, as I like to say, back in 1990 when George Bush, H.W. Bush, signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, it was probably 4 or 5 years before Al Gore invented the internet. That's a joke. And obviously, when we put together the Americans with Disabilities Act, the concept of the internet and just how pervasive the accumulation of information and the purveying of procuring services and buying things online was a good 8 to 12 years away from being fully functional. So we're in this sort of nebulous environment now where the Americans with Disabilities Act does not specifically address the web, the internet, web accessibility, and it's been subject to a lot of interpretation out there insofar as to what extent do the Americans with Disabilities Act relate to web content. And we all know what the overarching guideline of the Americans with Disabilities Act was designed to do, was really make equal access to everyone to physical buildings and infrastructures. And you know, principally what we have seen is where a lot of these preliminary rulings or assessments of the applicability of the Americans with Disabilities Act to web content often comes down to a specific question of, is your web presence an extension of a physical brick and mortar presence that you may have in an environment? So if you're a bank, if you're a retailer, if you're a school, if you're a college or university, or if you're a municipality, there are physical infrastructures where individuals can go to either interact, do commerce, accumulate information, and oftentimes there's an interpretation that any web-based presence or an extension of that ultimately needs to be as accessible as your physical presence. Now, does the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically state and all of the various guidelines within there, does it make any reference to the internet or digital accessibility or WCAG standards or 508 standards? It absolutely does not. It is subject to interpretation by federal court district after federal court district, and there's a lot of variation. Life would be so much easier for everyone if they just actually just made it black and white and incorporated into the rules, but they haven't done that. There hasn't been really a lot of will to do that. So, you know, we think of the concept of digital accessibility, and I think when you talk about making buildings or restrooms or things of that nature accessible, right, or sidewalks accessible or crosswalks accessible, I think we all get it, right? The concepts of ramps and rails and things of that nature that make access to physical space a lot easier. So within the world of digital accessibility, and you know, I think one of the interesting things is that the internet and the concept of digital content, and I would say by extension probably the iPhone, has been absolutely one of the most, I mean, it's been an amazingly empowering resource to a lot of different economies, a lot of different people, but I would tell you that individuals, specifically visually disabled, but individuals with disabilities have really found a tremendous amount of equality that's been driven as a result of being able to gain access to all kinds of information, content, purchasing opportunities via the web and via digital content. And frankly speaking, the sort of the mobility and ease of use of the iPhone and being able to carry that within your pocket really has been an incredibly empowering resource and has really leveled the playing field. It's gone a long way. But, you know, some of these assistive technologies and some of these things that have been out there, a lot of those technologies and a lot of those concepts were built and driven around when the internet was new, right? And we can go back to, there's this great little website called the Wayback Machine, and you can go back and take a look at any website and how it looked 10, 12, 15 years ago. And we all remember those early iterations of websites that we saw in 1998, 1999, 2000. They were very linear, not particularly graphic, no video, and some of these common assistive technologies or screen reader technologies that a lot of entities used very easily interacted with them, right? I mean, the complexity of the web design was not so significant that it was encumbering for them to interact, communicate, and provide that information back. So there's this sort of massive empowerment of the web and being able to access digital content. And I think, you know, we went through this rapid transformation on the web, and you take a look at the way websites are today, and, you know, I can remember 10, 15 years ago, you would sit there waiting to watch a simple 6-minute video, and it would take 45 minutes to buffer and load and be ready. And, you know, those days are long over. The web has really accelerated. I mean, the things from a design perspective and some of the things that are integrated into digital content now is truly, truly amazing. But something sort of happened in the middle of that intersection, and that was that rapid speed to innovate and create all kinds of new, rich, dynamic content really left those screen readers and those assistive technologies behind. As technology accelerated, a lot of the design function and criteria really did not take into consideration how those devices and how that empowerment that this population had gained access to would be treated. And I think at this point now we're in sort of this age of trying to catch up, right? Trying to level that playing field, get back to where we were originally designed to do. And I think clearly this is a space within the municipal and the government business where it's important. The sheer presence of the folks that are here to talk to you about this topic, it probably dominates 40, 50% of the floor out there. It's probably half of the presentations. So it's been sort of an interesting attempt to make certain that everyone is doing everything that they possibly can to serve every constituent in every community. So the concept of digital accessibility, and why I say that it really means more than compliance, is that there's a much, much larger population out there of those individuals that would principally use assistive technologies or really need the coding or the rendering of websites to be accessible to gain use of them, right? There's a massive population out there on a global basis, and the World Health Organization estimates it's upwards of 15 to 20% of the world's population in one way, shape, or form are impeded from being able to fully and completely consume digital content. And, you know, if you think of the communities in which you live, right, I mean, if 15 out of every or 20 out of every 100 people that pass you on the sidewalk have some impediment or some impairment in being able to consume content, that's problematic, and we're leaving a significant number of folks out. And really a very small percentage of those individuals may rely upon, utilize, or take advantage of some of the assistive technologies and some of the things that may be built into a Mac or into an iPhone to consume that content. And, you know, the idea is that how can we make digital content and how can we make infrastructures more usable? Because ultimately, there's a much larger population that will be able to take advantage of resources that are usable beyond accessible. And a couple of really great examples of this where you sort of think about the concept of inclusive or universal design and how it really helps a lot of folks, right? I mean, how many of you live in markets where Comcast is a cable provider in the market that you may live in? The Xfinity platform. So, you know, an interesting story is that the folks at Comcast and their chief accessibility officer really drove this initiative within the Comcast Xfinity infrastructure to build this this speech-controlled remote, and the whole idea, and the talking guide, and the whole idea was to really to deliver cable content in such a way that those individuals that are visually impaired can consume that content and have universal access to it. So they've rolled it out. They did a tremendous amount of advertising and brought a lot of attention to it. But the ironic thing about that is that, you know, Comcast can take a look at, and, you know, everything that's digital is measurable, and they actually find that nearly 1/3 of all households in the United States that have a talk-to remote use it at least once a month. And Comcast is pretty certain that not 1/3 of their customer base is visually disabled or has to rely upon that as the only means by which to interact with the set-top box. So the concept of a driven initiative around individuals with visual disabilities, the overall ability to really maximize and make inclusive design popular is important. You know, my wife is a great example of this, in that every time I turn on the television, which is not all that much these days with young boys, the first thing I see is that the closed captions are on, and it kind of drives me nuts, and the first thing I need to do is turn them off. My wife is not particularly hearing impaired, but sometimes she gets distracted by the boys or whatever it may be. Every time she watches television, she turns the closed captioning on, because it just makes it easier for her to follow along, or if there's a scene in a particular show that's low, right? I mean, so the fact is that when, and interestingly enough, one of the pioneers of driving closed captioning at PBS, which is the public broadcasting in Boston. The individual who was on that original team and drove that is actually the same individual who's now the chief accessibility officer at Comcast and actually drove the universal remote. But the point is that, you know, when you're tugging a suitcase in to a hotel and it's on wheels and you need to get up and you see stairs or you see a ramp, right? It's easier for you to use that ramp. I mean, there's an ease of use for you and an ability to do that, and you're not impairing anybody else, but the universal design of having that access or curb cuts when you're on a bike to go through a sidewalk makes things a lot easier. So the idea and what we really talk about is where's accessibility really make that transfer into usability, and how can you bring more individuals in? So, you know, what are your responsibilities as sort of the overseer of a web architecture within a government entity, right? There's obviously laws and regulations and guidelines, right? I mean, there's Section 508 that sort of pertains to the public sector, and we've gone through a 508 refresh, and my good friend in the back of the room, Jonathan from Level Access, will be giving a presentation on the 508 refresh, and you can see how that's sort of changed. There's all kinds of things that are happening in the marketplace. I mean, the Department of Justice right now has cited a number of municipalities for lack of access in their digital content. And frankly speaking, a lot of those activities did not initially start as a digital accessibility audit or look through. They received some sort of a formal complaint from someone on some other capacity within that municipality about limited access to something, voting or things of that nature. And frankly speaking, once they start taking a look at limited accessibility within one component of your municipality, it tends to spread and they look at everything, and ultimately your digital content comes under review. And then there's just the whole concept of good government practices, right? I mean, ultimately, you're there to serve every individual and every taxpayer within that community, and the idea of being able to really make content as accessible as possible is important. So what are the most common scenarios that we see in municipal government? And I kind of see three buckets that this falls into. You know, if the cocktail hour went on for another hour, I might have found 4 or 5 more last night. But the fact is, oftentimes, one of these 3 pillars is sort of the foundation of the way in which a lot of you kind of deliver and develop your web content for your municipalities, right? The one is that you sort of have in-house, you develop it, you design it, you do it on your own. We're finding less and less of this taking place. You have a third-party development firm that sort of is responsible for building, hosting, and maintaining your site. And then the third one is that you use a CMS platform. And oftentimes we've spoken to a number of individuals that use any combination of the 3 and maybe a couple of other things. But the one thing that seems to be fairly true, and when you're having a conversation about accessibility, it's never great to put the italicized words in the smallest print possible. So that's a design flaw on my behalf. But the bottom line is, when I was speaking, is that the vast majority of you consider yourself to be a team of one or on a very limited or small team with a lot of duties and a lot of responsibilities and a lot of people to serve. And ultimately being able to assure and make certain that every component and every element of content that gets delivered into any digital infrastructure that you may have is fully and completely accessible is difficult to do at the least. Resources are limited, the workload is high, and the idea is how can we really help with this, right? So a couple of things that we find when you use third-party applications. And third-party applications can be almost anything, right? Third-party application is something where you physically on a day-to-day basis don't touch the code. It could be a job site service that you use to put your municipal postings up. It could be internal resources and HR resources that your employees use to gain access to that are not accessible. But the one thing that's important, and I think that the world is starting to turn a little bit on this, is that regulatory compliance responsibility is not transferable. So we've spoken with a lot of organizations that have either received a demand letter or some sort of litigation or an OCR complaint or whatever it may be, and they would say, well, we bought this service and they told us it was accessible and we just found out the hard way that it wasn't. It's their fault. At the end of the day, it's not the third party's fault. It's your obligation to make certain that whatever digital content that you project in the marketplace via any means that you acquire to do so is ultimately accessible, and that unfortunately we can't go and blame other folks, right? And as I say, almost every web architecture in one way, shape, or form is reliant on some sort of third-party application, whether it's a career site, whether it's a payment process, or it's a complaint filing form. And then CMS platforms are really, really common in government presences. And more often than not, you can acquire these CMS platforms in the day in which you take delivery on your new site. You know, we would be very happy to look at it and say this is an outstanding site relative to its ability to meet the WCAG standards, Section 508 standards. Like, obviously, the entity that delivered you this platform did an exceptionally good job. The issue is that's a particular snapshot in time, right? And at that point now, we turn over the ability to add and include content into that infrastructure into a bunch of different folks. And not everybody is going to take the same level of responsibility or interest in making certain that that content is fully accessible. And ultimately, what we get is what we call the inaccessibility creep, if you will, right? So now all of a sudden, these CMS platforms start to contain a lot of content in there where top of mind was not accessibility. So when you're looking at third-party platforms or you're assessing your existing third-party platforms, a couple of things that we suggest that you do. The first thing is make certain that whatever new resources that you're buying in the RFP process, in your initial questioning with vendors, is that you make certain that they're accessible. And I can tell you the days have now passed where you can just simply say, hey, digital accessibility or Section 508 is important to us, and ask the sales professional if indeed it's accessible. I would tell you that 8 to 9 times out of 10, the sales professional has no idea. They'll go back and they'll ask somebody within their IT department, and they'll sort of look quizzically up in the sky and say, yeah, I guess it is, and they'll come back and they'll tell you that it is. So before you acquire that new resource, test it, make certain, right? There are third parties out there that you can take a look at. You can get VPAT statements. You can ask them to verify and validate the fact that what you're looking to acquire is indeed accessible. Don't find out the hard way, right? I mean, it's just not the best way to do it. And if you have existing resources that you know are part of your digital architecture and it becomes really difficult to extract yourselves from them because they're so integrated in, have some conversations with them. Ask them, what are they doing relative to digital accessibility? What is their long-term plan, right? I mean, the contracts that you have with them are probably going to come up at some point, and at least if you give them a couple of years to address it as a topic, they might be able to assist you with that. But ask them all. Because at the end of the day, it becomes important that from the beginning of the experience to the end of the experience, regardless of if you develop that content or you're using white-labeled versions of things, it has to be accessible. And then if you're using a CMS platform, have a plan to keep the new content accessible and compliant, right? I mean, make certain that you have an opportunity to do it. Too often we find people do a lot of work to assess and figure out where they are at a particular point in time. They do this big, gigantic catch-up. They deploy a lot of effort. Then they go on and tend to everything else that built up while they were doing that, and the whole process starts all over again, and it's this constant issue of playing catch-up. So a couple of things that we talk about, and this is where I talk about, how you can integrate accessibility and usability. And I really kind of refer to that as doing more than the minimum. And you may ask yourself, well, how can I do more than the minimum, right? So, I mean, one of the things you need to realize and need to understand is that there is a large and growing population of individuals out there, especially as baby boomers age, that they don't rely upon or use assistive technologies, but as their needs increase, they can benefit by additional resources that may be made available to them, right? I mean, it's, I think of my mom as a perfect example. It took me, 5 to 7 years to convince her that she shouldn't sit down and write out checks and buy stamps and mail her bills out on a monthly basis. She can do it by online banking. She became particularly good and adept and proficient after 5 years of begging her to do so, and then she got diagnosed with glaucoma, and now she has pretty rapidly declining vision, and she had grown dependent on that resource. But so by her bank being able to afford or avail her tools within their digital banking infrastructure, that makes it easier for her to zoom or increase her bank statement or take a look at things when transferring, it obviously helps her out tremendously, right? Things like resources that enable, say, individuals that have dyslexia to change the font and whatever content is displayed to them within their site. 7.5% of all Americans live with some form of dyslexia, right? I mean, those are not necessarily in your requirements under the WCAG or 508 standards. Don't require that you have to give the ability to display text and content on your site in a dyslexic font or customize it, but being able to have resources that make that available, make your site more usable, and ultimately serve a much wider constituency. I talked about it a little bit before, right? Assess and constantly reassess. There are assessment tools that are out there. You can constantly be looking at it. As I was sitting talking to some folks last night at the opening event, they got 2 emails from one of their assessment softwares that let them know literally while we were sitting there that some new content had gotten uploaded into their system that was inaccessible. And she, her point was that it was just adding up while she was away, and she had to get home and take a look at that. And then, one of the things I talk about when we talk about usability is I think if you really think about usability in the much larger population out there that can be assisted, if you think about usability first and accessibility second, it drives a better overall experience for everybody. There's a much wider population out there that can benefit. So I want to talk a little bit about a particular case study, and it's sort of an important one, and we have copies of this at our booth, and you can come by and take a look at it. But this is sort of speaking to an issue that we had with the Federal Communications Commission a couple of years ago, where they had made a determination that they wanted to begin to buy a lot more technology that was in the marketplace that did a much better job at what it took them 10 times as much in cost and time to build, and start to integrate them into their network of technology resources. And one of the things that they found is that some of the best resources that they found out there that would really help them and that they found were cutting edge were not accessible in any way, shape, or form. And, interestingly enough, when you're the Federal Communications Commission and a sizable amount of the things that you do as a regulatory body is actually enforce accessibility standards, it becomes fairly difficult to deploy resources that are not accessible. So in this particular case, they spent a tremendous amount of time looking out there, and because they really fell in love with this one particular resource, which is a complaint filing system called Zendesk. They're based out of San Francisco. They don't do very much business with business entities, but they're a particularly good complaint filing and maintenance and dispensation system. They really wanted to use it. And we were fortunate enough that they found us at AudioEye, and in essence what we've done is we've been able to take our technology, which is a technology that runs integrated into the Zendesk infrastructure, and in essence, on the fly, our technology will fix and remediate all of the issues and the errors that were making that infrastructure inaccessible. And at this point, they were able to build it into their architecture. And it's interesting what it's been able to do for us, because it's actually taken that one little situation where we were able to help them resolve one component, and they've actually found that the usability and the functionality of our services have actually blossomed out to go across the rest of the infrastructure at FCC. And I can just show you real quick, just to give you a sense for it, because I think when you talk about what it is and usability and things of that nature, it becomes a little bit difficult to comprehend. So this is let me just make this a little bit smaller here. This is the infrastructure at the FCC for filing complaints. So this was the forum when on the Super Bowl about 10, 12 years ago, when Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake were having their halftime event at the Super Bowl, and they had a pretty significant FCC violation. This particular page actually blew up because they filed more complaints than any single time in the history of the FCC on that date. They weren't on this form, but just to give you a sense, when people file complaints about federal communications related issues, it's basically you calling out issues with phone, television, or internet that are problematic. So this is a really important thing, and we talked about the reliance that individuals with disabilities have on technology, so that you can find that a lot of the impairments, it becomes hypercritical that these resources are accessible. So what we were able to do is implement our technology, and if our script were decoupled from this site, literally as soon as you get to the first link, you get into a keyboard hang up, and most screen readers and assistive technologies will hang you up and you can't get anywhere. So at this particular point in time, as soon as you come to this site, your screen reader will engage. Our technology will go through and identify those elements that are wrong, and we fix it. So we didn't change the code, we didn't do anything. If our script were to be decoupled from this, the site would be hopelessly inaccessible, right? But on top of that, and being able to make certain that the FCC was able to meet their own criteria that they actually enforce in other folks relative to accessibility, they had a really strong interest, in one of the things that appealed to them was really being able to make their infrastructure more usable. And when you hover over this little icon here, which I think we all recognize and see as the universal symbol, the global symbol for accessibility, what we're able to do is open up a series of tools and resources within the infrastructure that enable individuals to have a more usable experience within the site. And there's a couple of resources over here, and you just saw that tutorial that popped up, so a first-time user actually gets a quick little tutorial and explanation as to how these resources work. But once we've kind of delivered the foundation of accessibility to this format, we can now kind of layer usability on top of that and really bring a lot more people into the conversation and the equation insofar as making this a more usable experience. So we have three principal resources or tools that are built into this, something called a reader, a player, and voice. And reader is simply, as I like to refer to it, it's my version of the Wayback Machine. It's the way in which you can click a button and take a fairly graphically enhanced, highly sensitized site. You can bring it back to 1998 and make it look a little bit more linear, a little bit more straightforward, and a little bit easier for individuals that may have sensory or cognitive related issues to be able to consume that content, right? And if you want to get out of it, all you have to do is hit the escape key and it takes you back out, right? I mean, it's very simple to get out of it. But once you get in here, there's a series of tools that the tutorial would walk you through, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time showing how the tutorial worked, but with 3 or 4 very simple mouse clicks, you can do things like simply increase or decrease the font size, right? Individuals that may have color blindness or may have issues relative to color contrast ratios can simply just click the C button and it will change. They can also click the button down below, which will change it as well. There's a myriad of different ways to do it. And then one of the other things that you can do is for individuals that want to change the font or they find it a little bit more difficult to read, you can change the font, and we have 3 font offerings. This one in particular is one where you can set it to a font that's referred to as the Open Dyslexic font. This is a font that tends to weight the font a little bit lower, sort of grounds the words and the structure, the sentence structure, and has been found to work particularly well in assisting individuals that are dyslexic in being able to read and consume content. So you can imagine in your municipalities, if there are other individuals out there, just giving them the opportunity to customize the experience in such a way that it makes it a little bit easier for them. Some of the research has shown that blue backgrounds and green fonts in a dyslexic font tends to be a lot easier for individuals to read and consume. Some of the other research has shown that oftentimes individuals with dyslexia, a couple of things become problematic. Double letters together, like the 2 L's in tell, are problematic, and sometimes the density of the words themselves make it a little bit more difficult. So we just add simple functionality like clicking the K button that enables an individual to spread out the density of the words, and you can customize this experience. The nice thing about it is every time you return to the site and you enable the toolbar, it will automatically remember your settings, and we'll go into it. All right. One other thing real quick I'll show you, which is a very basic, simple screen reader.
Welcome to Player. Continue listening to learn more about using. Welcome to Federal Communications Commission Consumer Complaints. Consumer Complaint Center. File an informal consumer complaint / tell your story. Form. Site search form. This form contains 1 field and 1 button.
So we speak to a lot of people that sort of deal with making certain and assuring that digital architectures are accessible, and they've never actually seen or engaged a screen reader and knows how it works or knows what it does. And I like to kind of replay that a little bit so you get a little bit of a sense, right? How there's a couple of things that a screen reader will do. And this is a very basic, simple, lightweight screen reader that's not designed for individuals that use their own assistive technology. This is really designed for people that don't have access to that or don't know how to use the ones that may be built into their machine and make it very easy. The nice thing about it is there's no download, there's no plug-in, there's no application that you have to do. It just delivers within it. But just understanding the experience.
File an informal consumer complaint / tell your story. Form. Site search form. This form contains 1 field and 1 button.
So for us, in a visual type of an experience, we come to that. We know that it's a form. We know that it's got 1 field and it's got 1 button. We know that it is. But if you're using a screen reader and you're visually impaired, those descriptions, right? So when you talk about these alt texts and we talk about all these things that you add in and you're going through these processes, this is what it does. It ultimately transfers the visual experience into an audio experience and enables individuals to go through it. I only do this because there are a number of individuals out there that just haven't really experienced a screen reader engaged in an accessible format. But, a couple of the other things that you can do, you can
use the arrow keys to read through the form.
Increase the speed.
Press enter to submit. Search. Searching pod. Press Option less down to edit. Search Complaint Center.
Which you and I probably have a very difficult time hearing that, but I can tell you that individuals that rely on these technologies day in and day out can hear readbacks of screen readers at a 4x multiple over what we can do, and they can be just as efficient. So the idea and the concept is that when you have a foundation of accessibility, we like to deliver usability into that platform. So I just wanted to give you a very brief, and then just to show you a little bit of how that extended, we built it into Zendesk, and then what the FCC ultimately wanted to do is expand the resource across our entire digital architecture, because they felt that the usability function, even though they did a really good job of building their sites organically in accessible format, the usability was something that really compelled them. So with that, and if I give you 15 minutes of your life back at the end of this, it won't be the worst thing in the world, but I would be more than happy to field any questions and answer them as you may see fit. We have a case study on the FCC engagement that we had at our booth. Please stop by and pick up a copy of it. We'd be happy to share it with you and give you in a little bit more detail. At the end of the day, our motivations are simple. We want to help any organization out there that's looking to make as much digital content accessible as possible in the most effective and efficient way. We have found that there's a number of different ways that it can be accomplished. There are a number of different pitfalls and roadblocks that you can run into. Third-party applications have been one, right? Organizations can do a really good job organically, and then that last mile of accessibility can become really complicated because you don't control the code base. Your third-party application is not in tune to making things accessible. They just may not be motivated to do something about it, and how can you address that? And really what we've been able to do is develop a way to use and leverage technology to help organizations with that last mile of making certain that everything's buttoned up. So that's kind of a quick overview and a sort of discussion about a different approach and a different way in which digital accessibility can be applied, and how you can kind of scale technology when you're a department of one or a department of few, and how you can leverage and utilize technology to be more effective. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If there's any observations or thoughts, I'm more than happy to open up a discussion if that's desired. Anyone? In the front?
Technically, how is it that you do the overlay?
So there's a JavaScript include. So there's a line of code that gets included into any digital content. It goes into the header or the footer, and that essentially carries with it a library of some of the more traditional issues of inaccessibility that we would find, and generally speaking, that technology right out of the box will address anywhere between 40 and 60% of the common issues that we would typically find in a digital platform. And then we have a team of engineers and accessibility experts that work in our office out of Atlanta, and then essentially what we do is we take a look at all of those remaining errors that we can define and determine that are in fact true errors or issues of accessibility as opposed to false positives. And in essence, what we do is we customize and alter the script to address each one of those individual remaining use cases that we find to assure that that script now will fix, once the DOM fully renders and your screen reader engages, every time that we identify one of those issues, the JavaScript essentially remediates that issue on the fly and renders that content back to the screen reader in a way that the screen reader can fully essentially consume that content. And then in addition to that, one of the other things, and I think this is one of those things that's beneficial, especially within CMS platforms where you're uploading a lot of content and it evolves, is that we're constantly monitoring and assessing on an ongoing basis any new and additional content that you put up to identify those elements that may be up and running within your infrastructure that are indeed not compliant, and make certain that we assess it. So it's really, the technical term would be it's an overlay. So it really renders a differentiated version of the site to the screen reader user, but it has no impact on any other user that's not using the assistive technology. You had a question? Yeah, so when you're in those preferences, they're automatically saved, they're cached, and when you come back, it automatically would return. So, if you made a determination that the dyslexic font works really well for you, and you love the setting of having a blue background and a green, and that's where you leave it, and that's where you left, when you come back to that site and you deploy the Audio UI tools, it would automatically return you to those settings. You don't have to go back every single time and reset them. It cookies your preferences. Yes, ma'am.
Does this work with the documents or the videos on the site?
So we're working on some technology, and we're really hopeful to be able to integrate the concept of I think PDF remediation, PDF issues is one of the biggest conundrums that's out there. So we're working on something where we're going to be able to automate and build that in. We're not quite there yet. We're getting particularly close, but what we really do is with many of our customers is we can do everything. Technology will basically do everything with the documents, and then we work with the organizations to give you the context and the understanding on how to go in and actually go through the process of manually remediating. But give us a couple months, probably by the end of the year, and we're going to feel pretty comfortable that we'll have the technology where we'll be able to render a version of that PDF in a format that will be accessible for the end user. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The users that are utilizing your technology, don't they have their own screen readers or their own software?
Absolutely. So it's really, really important to note and to understand, right? I mean, our functionality and our technology is designed to serve two specific constituencies. And that's why I talk about accessibility and usability, because I find them to be very, very different. So an individual that's using their own screen reader, whether it's VoiceOver on a Mac or NVDA or JAWS or whatever it may be, all they care about is that they come to a site and that their technology engages and gives them a completely and fully accessible experience. Our technology running on the back side of that will engage that screen reader and provide that user a fully accessible functionality. They never have to open up our tools. They don't have to engage our screen reader. But the issue is that a very small percentage of the U.S. population or the global population actually will rely upon or utilize those technologies. My mom's a perfect example. She has low and declining vision right now. I will tell you, she's not going to become proficient and at 72 years old make the determination that she's going to become a power user of an assistive technology. But being able to have a very simple, basic, lightweight resource built into a site that enables her with 2 or 3 basic keyboard commands to consume 80 or 90% of that content in an audio transcribed way is incredibly beneficial to her. So the idea is, we talk about 15 to 20% of the population that's out there that's really impeded from being able to fully and completely consume digital content. A very, very, very small portion of that population actually use on a regular basis their own assistive technologies to consume that content. And the idea is, once you build that foundation of accessibility, the way in which our technology works, it becomes very easy to layer those tools of usability on top of it. So our approach is not to replace anyone's screen reader. Bring your own screen reader. It works. It'll work fine. If you use VoiceOver or use JAWS, you're going to find a fantastic experience at the FCC complaint site. However, if you don't have any assistive technology and you just find that being able to increase or decrease the font size is to your benefit, or having an audio transcription of something is helpful and is a little bit easier, like turning closed captions on your TV or using the voice-activated remote, it's there. No one's forced to use it, and we certainly wouldn't ask anyone who's used to using their own technology to change or alter. Any other questions? Any other feedback? So if I give you, say, 15 or 20 minutes of your day back, would that be beneficial? Could you go check your emails? I mean, my point is, I have a point to make, and if I can do it in 35 minutes, I would rather do that than as opposed to put another 7 slides and keep you here for an extra 20 minutes. So I very much appreciate your time and your willingness to hear us out. If there's a particular accessibility-related conundrum or issue you have, or if you're one of those teams of one and you wish you could clone yourself 3 or 4 more times to be more effective, you can at least hand us the keys insofar as accessibility, and we could probably make a pretty significant impact in your effectiveness on that. So I thank everybody for coming. Appreciate your time. Look forward to seeing you over the next couple of days for the conference. Thank you.